Today's presentation is titled Small Design Moves Create Big Campus Impact. You'll learn more about how education institutions face challenges in areas like deferred maintenance, infrastructure renewal, increasing accessibility, and improving sustainability on campus. Our speakers are Rebecca Berry, AIA Lead AP, Principal, President, and Director of Sustainability with Finegold Alexander Architects, and Michelle Mayhew, Director of Planning, Design, and Construction at Wellesley College. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn the time over to them. Rebecca, take it away.
Thank you, Matt. So as Matt so ably noted, our presentation today is entitled Small Design Moves Create Big Campus Impact. So we're going to talk through all these different issues in a way that goes both back and forth between macro and micro. So just quickly again, I am Rebecca Berry, Principal at Finegold Alexander Architects.
And I am Michelle Mayhew, the Director for Planning, Design, and Construction at Wellesley College. Hi, everybody.
As usual with any presentation that is about learning, we have learning objectives. We won't read all of them, but we hope that you will take all of these things away and more from today's webinar that we're sharing with you. We are going to focus on sort of 4 big areas in this kind of broader theme around big moves and small moves. And they are sustainability, deferred maintenance, campus accessibility, and equity, specifically in this case, and housing. These are issues with which we feel many of you who are involved with campuses or even systems of education are probably familiar and with which you probably are grappling on a daily basis. So we're going to take these in order, starting with sustainability.
And I am going to kick us off with this. And as we go from these macro campus planning initiatives and priorities, we're going to tie each one of these to a specific project. It will be the same project you'll hear throughout our presentation. So although we have 4 different macro campus planning issues we're talking about, we'll always tie them back to examples in the same project. And the goal here is to talk to you about real tangible ways that you can take campus planning actions and then implement them and make them real time on your campus. So I'm going to start talking about sustainability and specifically the importance of energy and greenhouse gas reductions on our campuses. All campuses are getting pressure. The whole world is getting pressure, right, to be more sustainable and to reduce our greenhouse gases. And what does that mean on a college campus with a large infrastructure? The first thing I want to say, and this is really true of any of the planning principles that I'm going to be sharing with you today, that these are long-term plans. And because they're long-term, they really need to have 2 essential components to them. One is that they're going to be phased. You're not going to get them all done at one time. You're going to have to understand that these are going to take many years to implement your goals across broad initiative campus planning issues. And they have to be iterative. And what do I mean by that? Things change. Priorities change. We lose funding. We gain funding. As the world changes, your plan has to change with it. So consider it iterative. Consider it a live plan that you must revisit from time to time throughout this long duration. And you go back to and redefine, is everything still in line with where we started? So that's a common theme that I'm going to be suggesting throughout these different presentations. So we're going to start in our central utility plant. And this is the heart of our college where we have generation of our cooling, generation of our electricity, and generation of our heat. And as with a large infrastructure campus, this is the majority of where the greenhouse gas is being generated. So we look to the source, but we're also looking at the buildings themselves and how the energy is being distributed and delivered and then used within the building. So we're looking at the source, but then we're also looking at the endpoints as well. I'm just going to take a very, very brief side tour, even though we just started the presentation, to use as an example how at Wellesley College, we really try to make our planning initiatives reflect our mission and reflect our values and priorities. And that's important for all institutions. And so what is this a photo of? As we were redesigning our central utility plan and thinking about the needs, we were kind of drawn to the different colors you'll see here of, green for go. Green is energy, it's the electrical engines part, and the blue for cooling and the chillers, and the red for the heat. And we drew upon those and found inspiration from the actual paint colors with an artist who lived back in the 20s, a Black woman artist who represents diversity and represents the idea of creativity and equity and diversity, and that's a value that's really important to our campus. So we took inspiration and even chose colors of something as simple as a central utility plant that reflected some of our other values as a campus. Right, back to our regularly scheduled agenda here. So as we were evaluating what we were going to do to become greenhouse carbon neutral and reduce our greenhouse gases, we had to start, and you always have to start with any of your campus priorities, as where you are right now. And so this map was showing us, we were starting to understand, where does our energy come from? Where does our energy usage come from? And therefore, once we know where it comes from, how can we reduce it? And in what steps can we reduce it? So this was really our plan looking forward for how we were going to reduce electricity, natural gas, and other forms of energy on our campus, and mapped out some milestones along the way. This is that phased multi-year approach. So a lot of it had to do with our central utility plant. We actually stopped a cogen facility that we had and put in just a small 4 megawatt peak shaving plant for our electricity, and tapped into our local municipality, which has many more opportunities to buy green than we had to generate green on campus. So that was a major change in our electricity generation. We made all of our chillers electric. So instead of operating off of natural gas, that took a huge chunk. Natural gas is a real beast when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. And that's the last piece we have left, is the natural gas feeding our steam plant. And how can we reduce that? And that's where it came to a point where we wanted to set a line, that dashed line in red, of a decision point at 2030. As we were starting to make improvements at the plant and in our buildings for energy efficiency, that was another huge area we looked at: lighting improvements, heat delivery improvements, energy controls in terms of operating HVAC. But eventually we had to look at how we're going to feed these buildings for the heat. And so we identified 2030 as a decision point, thinking that geothermal is probably the direction we're going to go, but wanting to give ourselves some opportunity to see how technology is going to evolve. Because we know technology can increase dramatically. We've seen that all in our lives. And maybe by 2030, there might be some new energy sources, like battery development is really big, or hydrogen development is on its way. And so there might be a better choice by 2030. And we want to revisit the decision at that time. So this was our map as we started, as our way to kind of check in and see how we're doing. And that's what we do often and regularly. We check in and see how we're doing. So here we are now at about 2024. This map's a little bit outdated, but what we have done is we've actually, by the changes in the central utility plan and the energy efficiencies in the building, we've already reached our 50% goal reduction. So we're ahead of the curve from what our original plan is. But the other major thing to consider is, if none of you have heard of it, there's a major government incentive right now called the Inflation Reduction Act. And it results in government credits that can give campuses like ours funds towards these kinds of projects, towards these greenhouse gas emission projects, primarily geothermal. So something that we were going to wait until 2030 to decide, should we do it or not, we're starting to expedite, because we could save up to 40% of the cost of the installation of these systems if we could be eligible for these credits through the Reduction Act. So we're changing what the rules were. We were going to wait till 2030, and we're going into a more expedited planning study to see maybe we push that decision along sooner and try and be eligible for these credits. So what would that look like? We're starting to look at where we could put geo well fields on our campus. How many would we need? Where would they be located? How would the buildings that receive that system be renovated to receive it? What order would we do them in? Is there other deferred maintenance in those buildings we'd like to tackle? So what's the cost? What's that long-term plan? How long would it take? We're in the process right now of studying that in a pretty detailed way. And what credits would we be available? And to give you some examples how these energy savings goals played out in a specific project. Again, I mentioned we'll use one project throughout the presentation. It's Severance Hall. It's one of our residence halls, one of our dorms. And Rebecca's going to tell you a little bit how we implemented some of these ideas.
So in terms of thinking at the building scale, we had to really think about two major aspects to this kind of energy transition that Wellesley was making plans for, right? We had to think about work at the envelope and work at the interior. So we're going to start this bit with talking mostly about the envelope. So we were initially tasked by Wellesley to study what makes sense in terms of what we like to call energy conservation measures, right? Many of you know the term, the ECMs, at the envelope of these buildings. Many of Wellesley College's residence halls, in fact, many of your buildings, right, Michelle, are early 20th century buildings. They are what we refer to as mass masonry walls. They have steel windows, which are operable from that same time period, and many of them have slate roofs. So they are of a particular era. And so while we were looking at moves specifically at Severance, they were moves that were meant to be exemplars of what could be done elsewhere, right? When you're looking at further buildings in the Res Hall portfolio. So we broke the envelope down as a part of this study and other aspects of the building into particular components, right? So we developed an approach and we said, what if we upgraded, for instance, the roof? What if we insulated the roof? What if we insulated the walls? What if we replaced the windows? What about mechanical moves, which we'll talk about a little bit later? Electrical upgrades, appliances, all these questions in terms of kind of energy inputs. And we developed, for instance, sets of details and approaches to these questions, which were then taken to a CM and were looked at in terms of price. And we did a whole life cycle cost analysis to try to figure out what gave the best return on investment in terms of energy use reduction versus cost, right? So what we ultimately ended up deciding was the best approach, again, based on a whole life cycle cost analysis, was what you see in particular here on this slide relative to envelope. So there were really two big keys to this. The first was about insulating at the walls. And we should be really clear that this was insulating at the interiors of the walls, because of course these are historic buildings, so we couldn't modify the exterior appearance, right? We can't overclad these buildings, and we can't go and strip off the existing envelope and change it. So we were working on the inside. And the other piece was looking at the windows. So the age of the windows and the type of the windows meant that replacement was going to be extremely expensive on a kind of a per window, per square foot, sort of whatever basis you looked at it. And really, we determined that we could get a lot of value out of window repairs, sealing at the windows, and installing interior storm windows. And that really greatly reduced things like our air infiltration, which is one of your biggest places where you lose heat in a building. So all of those things together enabled us to create a 43% decrease from the sort of median dormitory energy use as a result of these efforts. Additionally, we did look at the mechanical system, and this is important to this other kind of energy change that Michelle was speaking of for the whole campus, which is if you're going to move off of a lot of natural gas use, if you're going to decrease your energy use, you don't want to be making steam, right? Steam is a very energy intensive way of heating, and there's a lot of transmission loss. So as part of thinking about these other potential sources, be they geothermal, it should include battery storage or thermal energy storage, what you want to do is you want to look at distributing low temperature hot water. So we looked at the change outs of the mechanical systems in the building to low temperature hot water. The other piece is these two parts go together, right? So if we're putting less heat energy into the building, we want to make the building tighter. We want to make it more energy efficient. So the approach that we took at the absolute micro level, this is 3 pictures of an existing dorm room, before, during, and after, right? So you see the simple room on the left, plaster applied directly to brick backup at the exterior walls, a wall-mounted radiator in each case, and you can see these 1920s vintage steel windows. On the middle image, you see the blown-in insulation, the new stud wall that's built at the exterior wall. You can see how we worked our way around the existing stone surrounds at the windows, that historic detail. And then in the end, we have this furred out exterior wall that's nice and tight, provides for a good amount of insulation, a new radiator, which if you look carefully, you'll probably notice it's a little bit larger than the original one because again, it's low temperature hot water. In this case, at Severance, these were high temp already. In some buildings, they are steam, but in every case, the radiators do get larger. So you have to do planning for that at the micro level, as opposed to the macro level. And then what is actually very hard to see are very carefully incorporated interior storm windows, which are laid in over the existing windows. And then throughout the building, we took this approach at the exterior walls. And we also, of course, had to run miles of new electrical, miles of new pipes, right, to get all of this to work for the project. But in the end, one nice aspect that we had is we had rooms that were now more comfortable, they were refreshed, and we're going to talk a little bit about this later in another piece of the presentation around equity, that with some new furniture, we were actually better able to occupy these rooms in terms of occupant numbers and having a more standardized approach to, for instance, you'll see this as a double. What is a double, right? Additionally, one approach that was taken, and this was a careful consideration again as a part of this project, was that it was determined that the entire building would not be air conditioned, that air conditioning would be installed in very select locations where students could gather and where they were together and where they could get cool, for instance, if there was a hot day. This is definitely an energy savings approach, and it's a targeted cost approach. So this picture that you see here is how the room, which is known as the morning room, which exists in all of these older res halls where people used to come visit the students, exists. And then the work that we did to enable this room to be air conditioned. So you can see behind, if you look carefully, you can see behind this beautifully carved wood screen with all its Gothic detailing is an interior glazed storefront. So we closed this area off, yet kept it very open to a new refreshed entryway so that students could gather here, and it provided a space for cooling. Next, we're going to talk about deferred maintenance, everyone's favorite topic. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yes, and it ties into some of the things you've been hearing us talk about when we talked about renovating Severance Hall. And this is a map of our campus here at Wellesley College. We have a lot of buildings. We're a relatively large campus for a relatively small student body. And that means we have enough buildings that exist, and we don't build a lot new, but we have a lot of old buildings. And a lot of these older buildings have not been, renovated in a significant way over the last several decades. And while we do maintain them on a day-to-day basis, as all of you know, things reach the end of their useful life, whether that be a roof, whether that be an air handler unit, and servicing them becomes even increasingly difficult, if not impossible. They become very inefficient. And so I'm preaching to the choir when everybody knows that deferred maintenance is a big problem on all of our campuses. And like everyone, our needs outweigh our resources, meaning there's way more work and need in these buildings than we would ever have enough money to do. So how do we start to tackle anything, getting anything done, given that huge problem? And approaching our residence halls was a big question that we worked on for a couple of years, honestly, to build a plan on how to create upgrades that would, again, feel equitable for all of our students and their experience. And how we did that is we started looking at our campus and breaking it down into neighborhoods of residence halls rather than a building by building. And what we have is we have an East Side, a Quad Quint, and a Tower Hill, 3 different neighborhoods. And we started to look at the deferred maintenance needs in those buildings. And we looked at them throughout campus. At first, we did what we call a facility condition assessment. If you've never done one, it's a great tool to get a really macro picture of where your deferred maintenance is at, which buildings are worse, and then you can prioritize among that. But we had the full list of things that needed to be done in these buildings. We wanted new mechanicals and electricals and fire protection and roofs and masonry and bathrooms and kitchenettes and interior finishes. And again, we only had a certain amount of dollars, and we wanted to touch every large residence halls. We have 12 large halls, 1 medium size. So we say we have about 13 large halls. And how could we create a program that was going to be consistent, that everybody could feel some level of upgrade, and yet really start to tackle this deferred maintenance problem that we had? So we created a 10-year plan, and we're a couple of years into that 10-year plan. One of the difficulties for us is that we could not create any solution for space. So we could not take a residence hall offline to bring it up to renovation in these various areas. And instead, we're tackling it in summertime. So we call them our summer slammers. And because there's a fair amount of work to do and it's very disruptive, we've broken each building that we'll renovate, those 13 buildings, into 2 summers. Not the most efficient, adds a little bit of cost, but I tell you these stories because the plan isn't always perfect. The plan is sometimes what's the best we can do to make progress and keep the ball rolling forward. So this 10-year plan had to be financially equitable. It had to be experience for our students that was still going to maintain a quality of living when they were here. And so we broke it down in this 10 years, 2 summers per building, and you'll see the 3 neighborhoods in the 3 different colors and how the different buildings have flushed themselves out. We are done with Severance, halfway done with Tower, and starting Claflin, if you look at those buildings in the left-hand view. And we've learned a lot. This is another practice that I really encourage your institutions to do. We have paused at the end of each one of these and what lessons have we learned and what can we do better going forward. And we're taking sort of a major pause after Claflin and saying, where have been the risks? Where have been the real areas that we've had a hard time? And I'll name a few. We're reconsidering that decision on air conditioning because climate change is only getting more in our face. And sooner or later, we might have to deal with the fact that we need to air conditioning these rooms. Is that the right decision for the next 10 years? Masonry approach. We aren't fully repointing the entire building. Our approach is generally 25%. This is a strategy so that everybody gets something and we improve the buildings, all buildings. But we walk away with 25% repointing and we're getting leaks still in the other parts of the building we're not repointing. Do we need to reconsider that strategy? And lastly, we are looking at this 2 summers per building. It's very difficult to achieve. It's not only the risk of, heads in the beds, but it's the wear and tear on the teams and the amount of productivity. So we're going to see if we can be creative and rethink our strategy about how we move forward in the out years to come. So all that to say, when we decided that we were going to move forward with this plan, we started with a study. And same as where we're at with the geothermal, we're studying. This slide speaks to, where the study started, and we picked a representative building of all of those residence halls to try and test the theories we had about the kind of scope we want to do. Could we do it in 2 summers? What would the cost be? To drive that 10-year plan, a study is a really, really important first step. And we teamed with Finegold Alexander, who then turned that study into reality. So Rebecca can tell you how some of this deferred maintenance played out in Severance Hall.
So as Michelle intimated, there was a lot of work that had to be done in a very short period of time, twice, right? So we had to deoccupy the building, if you will, work on the building, get the heads back in the beds. And the work that was done was very varied and touched sort of every aspect of the building while still not being a gut renovation. So these pictures here, for instance, tell a bit of a story of our exterior work. So as Michelle noted, what we've been doing is addressing areas where we have known leaks, where through building surveys and previous studies that Wellesley has been done, we know that there are problems. And then we have to be nimble and adjust. So for instance, some of these photos that you're seeing here speak to things like you just need time even to get scaffolding up on the building so that you can get closer to the building and really understand whether you need to adjust your scope at your slate roof. Do you need to adjust your scope of repointing? Are there windows that are more badly damaged than you thought that they were? And then you just handle it and work as a team and adjust. And it's a lot of, late nights and a lot of effort, but in the end, you do get through it. We also, at Severance in particular, of course, there's all the work at the interior. And again, these photos are just indicative of some of the parts and pieces that were part of that deferred maintenance plan. Everything from work to put systems up into new ceilings, new bathrooms, because all the bathrooms in the building were completely replaced. Accessibility, which we're going to talk a little bit about later, that involves things like connecting to other parts of the building that were not accessible. And then, of course, all that work in all of the sleeping rooms, over 100 of them, to get the walls insulated and to get those windows completed so that the rooms would be comfortable for students. And while we were at it, you may have noticed there was that last little bullet point on the deferred maintenance slide that talked about what were the goals that Wellesley had for these projects. And one of those goals was, where we can do it, let's make program improvements, right? That wasn't the driver for these projects. The driver is things that we're talking about, like energy, deferred maintenance, accessibility. But through a little bit of creativity and looking at occupancy, which we'll talk about later, you start to make small design moves, right, that do change aspects of the building. So for instance, this is a little partial demo plan, and it shows you up here, this area where there was a little sort of storage room that wasn't really very heavily used. There was a single room here, and through some other looking at what we'll call right sizing that we'll talk about later, we determined that we could actually take this room out and get the bed back elsewhere. And what that enabled us to do was to create the expanded dorm room that you see up here. This is suddenly a double. And this is now a very open and accessible kitchenette, which not only created space that was usable by those who are mobility impaired, but also made a big move where you had a sort of a T corridor before. So you have to sort of imagine that this space is just blank, right? And you have this long corridor one way and a short corridor another way. And all of a sudden now you have an open space where students can gather, and it's a little relief valve from this kind of long double loaded corridor, which really just has to do with how the building is constructed. And it also brings light into a space which otherwise wouldn't have as much light, right? And in the same vein, in terms of, we always were looking for these little moments, right? Like, where can we make change? So for instance, at the first floor, there was a space that was no longer utilized for what it had been, which is this former residence director apartment. There's been a change to how Wellesley handles residence directors. So this space was literally unused, right? And when we were thinking about res hall rooms, this didn't seem like a very good spot to put a resident because it's literally in the path of travel of, you know, all the folks who are coming into the building, who are the residents and visitors. Additionally, we saw an opportunity to create, for instance, access to daylight, because before when you came in, it was all dark. So now through capturing this space from the former director's apartment and a new wall opening, we were able to create access to daylight and a very different feel from this is what it was like when you kind of came in the door before. You came in and you looked, and there was the morning room over there on the left, but it was very dark and closed in. And now when you come in, you have access to a space where students can hang out, and that space has access to daylight. So this was not a lot of work to do this, and it fit within all of the other deferred maintenance and accessibility goals and really made a big impact in terms of the student experience.
Another big impact for us was how we were going to address accessibility, ADA accessibility. And for folks who may not be from Massachusetts on this call, our governing regulatory agency here is called the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board, or MAB. And they recently adopted a process where they'll work with campuses, places that have housing across a large piece of land, and create a housing plan that can address accessibility at a more macro campus-wide level rather than building by building level. And this was a game changer for our 10-year plan that we were putting together for residence halls. Every other time we had tried to tackle the problem of upgrading our residence halls, because they're so old, because they're architecturally really interesting but very difficult to make accessible, the cost just kept increasing, and we had less money to do deferred maintenance, and all it was becoming was accessibility, which is not a bad thing. But again, in these balancing priorities, we just couldn't seem to create a plan that was financially feasible and giving a level of upgrades that would really make an impactful difference. So creating this accessible housing plan and working with MAB allowed us to address our campus at that neighborhood level that I spoke to earlier about our 10-year plan. So we're achieving access by neighborhood rather than by building and building. So you'll see anything that's green on this is a building that we're making, quote unquote, fully accessible. By the way, anybody who knows anything about access, that's a unicorn. There's no such thing as fully accessible, maybe for a brand new building, but not a 1920s building, but fully accessible. The yellow or orangey color is visitable. Visitable means you can get in the door, you can get to a common space, you can get to some elements of the first floor. And then red is a non-accessible, completely non-accessible hall. And so we worked for 2 years with an accessibility planner and with MAB, the government agency, to come up with this plan and create this approach that not only worked for our deferred maintenance and renovation upgrades, but also reflected the culture and mission of our residence hall program. Because they're trying to create equity and experience at this neighborhood level, this plan was genuine in terms of experience by the student could be held in any one of these neighborhoods and still have some equity, even if it's not in every single building. So we had to be genuine about what, again, does our campus stand for in terms of experience and culture. So this was really huge. It was a 2-year effort. And we eventually signed a legal agreement called a Memorandum of Understanding with the state. And every time we go with one of these buildings for a permit, we're bringing back this housing plan. We're reminding them of this approach. Now, board members change because although there's administrative staff, the board changes throughout the years. And we have to re-remind them, this was the mission, this was the agreement, this is what we're supposed to do. It's not always easy, but it is extremely helpful. And it's been very, very effective in allowing us to move forward with the renovations. Severance was and we've prioritized 2 in the 10-year plan. As we move to a neighborhood, we'll do the accessible buildings first in the renovations, and then the non-accessible ones later in the plan to try and prioritize and expedite. So Severance was one of our first buildings because it became accessible.
So as Michelle was noting, as anyone who's ever worked with a 1920s Victorian pseudo-Gothic structure knows, it's tricky. And Severance has a particularly interesting aspect to it in that it actually steps up the hill to what is known as Tower Hill, where the 3 buildings, Severance, Tower, and Claflin, are located. So Severance really is a building that's very long and it's about 2 ends. So you have a northerly end, which sits down lower in elevation, and a southerly end up toward the lake that sits higher. And while Wellesley had elevators in each of these 2 ends, there was physically no way to get from one to the other because in this middle portion of the building here, there was about a 7-foot difference between one side and the other. And so this became the area that we had to tackle. And the way we approached it was through the creation of a small addition tucked into this little spot here that you see, which is hidden within an interior sort of captured courtyard. So this courtyard that you're seeing here, this is what it looked like before. And this is between Severance Hall and Tower Hall. And this is a spot that unless you know how to get to it, you wouldn't necessarily ever go there. So this became the perfect location to think about creating something that could bridge the gap between these 2 sides. So again, this is the northerly end, the southerly end. You get a sense just by the heights of the buildings here, right? Like how much topography change we're talking about navigating. So we created this small addition that got you to an elevator that navigated that difference between the location here where you come into the building and over here at the southerly wing. And it had a lot of benefits to it beyond simply creating accessibility, which is that because this corridor was still going to be your main way, right, through the building and between these 2 wings, locating ourselves next to it created what is essentially about as universal of an experience as you can get for someone who's mobility impaired versus someone who's coming up these stairs and walking through this corridor to another set of stairs, because you go through the same archway. You can see how we navigated this. We removed a couple of different sets of stairs, created a new one, and then created a ramp that takes you over to this end of the addition where you get to the elevator. So you have to be really, really creative with these moves in existing buildings when you're thinking about accessibility. But there's always going to be like that one piece that just kind of unlocks the puzzle. And this was the piece that unlocked that puzzle at Severance.
The last planning principle and priority for Wellesley that we're going to talk about is equity. Equity is a core value at our campus, but as Rebecca mentioned in the beginning, we're going to apply this principle to housing. And as we were going through these various studies and looking at accessibility and how do we create equal access across neighborhoods, when we were looking at deferred maintenance and how do we tackle these buildings and get the bathrooms where they need to go and meet all the current codes, we started to realize that we had some inequities in our housing. And by that, I mean, we would go into a building and see a room that was 150 square feet that was a double next to the same exact size room and configured room that was a single. And we started scratching our heads and said, what horse is driving the cart here? It seemed as if the categories of rooms and the layout of rooms had become in response to sort of students' desires rather than a more standardized way of offering rooms and then meeting the demand of students within the standards that we had. And so we had to pause throughout some of the other planning we were doing, deferred maintenance and accessibility, and take a look at our residence hall beds throughout every single building. So you'll see the different neighborhoods that I've been talking about are reflected in the different categories here. And we started to look, where do we have singles, doubles, triples, and how might, as we are renovating these buildings. Now, we didn't rip down walls and reprogram them. Sometimes it was simply a furniture solution. As Rebecca showed in an earlier slide, we started to loft beds and put the dressers under the bed. And that meant maybe we could think about the square footage of rooms, and what used to maybe just be able to be a single because of the furniture we were using could potentially become a double. And so through looking at furniture strategies and equity, we had situations where we'd have a double, but only one closet in the room. Do we need to add an armoire? Or do we need to renovate the room and add a closet? So a lot of these started to feed some of the other decisions we were making. But again, remember, we're in older buildings. And so don't be fooled by just looking at floor plans and saying, oh, these two are exactly the same. The Finegold team really had to study every single room because there are quirky things that you'll find. And I'll hand it to Rebecca to explain.
Thank you. It was indeed a finding of quirkiness. So we had a whole host of sort of barriers, let's call them, that we had to assess and think about how we could work around, from, for instance, the fact here that you see in this slide, right? So all these highlighted spaces, if you just looked at the square footage number alone, you're like, oh, these are doubles. But you can't fit the furniture in. They're funny shapes. There are different configurations. There's these old built-in benches. So how on earth, are we going to create standards, right, when you have all of these kind of exceptions to the rule of, if you can imagine when you're planning a residence hall today, what are you creating, right? You're creating a bunch of simple rectangles so that you can lay things out in a very standard manner. And so, for instance, there was all this variation on the right there, in terms of what occupancies were. And so we wanted to say, okay, how can we really make this happen? So to understand that, we began by literally going into every single room in every single residence hall on campus and understanding the existing conditions. We highlighted, where are there risers for MEP systems? Where are there radiators and different heating units that bump out into the room? What about, furniture types and how they affect things? And, funny existing conditions such as, head height in rooms, for instance, varied a lot because you sometimes had sloped rooms, sometimes you had turret rooms, sometimes you had shorter dropped areas down at the windows for bays. So we had to catalog all of that. And we recorded all of that information on plans and laid all of that out. But additionally, we then ended up creating some of the world's largest spreadsheets, right, that listed occupancies for all of these rooms with different aspects to them, right? So for instance, how many students could you put in this space with the constraints using the existing furniture types that Wellesley College had purchased and was located there at the moment? What would happen, as Michelle was mentioning earlier, if you were able to loft the beds, right? Suddenly pushing a dresser under a bed makes a huge difference. All of a sudden that 20 square feet, it's like gold, right? In terms of trying to think about occupying room differently. So what does that mean for the occupancy? And so for instance, we went and said, wow, if you really did that, right, you could really maximize the occupancy. Maybe the campus could actually gain beds. Oh, but wait. Then we had to think of other things. So after we went through this exercise and created, these new room layouts and said, okay, here's with new furniture, here's what it could look like, et cetera, isn't this great? So for instance, imagine the ripple effect of, say you have a bunch of doubles that used to look like this and you make them triples. What do you affect? Well, you have code issues all of a sudden, right? Because suddenly we realized that while we could gain beds, we had to think about the number of bathrooms and plumbing fixtures that we had available to students. And we had to think about it on a per floor level, not just a whole building level. So for instance, we had buildings where the total count would work, but it didn't work by floor. So we had to drive all that information back into our analysis and ultimately come up with sort of 3 approaches and understandings of how you could occupy the buildings. There was this maximization, absolute maximum count with room configuration. Again, to Michelle's point, we weren't moving walls, we weren't changing configurations, right? There's the historic, which would be, for instance, a grandfathered occupancy. Because for instance, some places like the plumbing count doesn't meet current code, but unless you go through and completely get rid of the building, that's fine, right? You can work with what you have. And then there's the equity, that question of making a more regular approach to the rooms across all of the res halls. So that led to a different set of floor plans and a different approach to furniture, which hopefully keeps being come back to. So for instance, when we started the Severance project, as Michelle will tell you, and we looked at floor plans, we said, okay, what does this housing study tell us, right? Where would we potentially make moves? Where could we shift beds based on the information that we gathered so that we try to adhere to these new standards that we have all created together? So one of the interesting sort of intersections of looking at code, looking at equity, looking at accessibility, and frankly, looking at scheduling. So we talked earlier about how difficult it is to do this much work in a summer, right? Is how all these things kind of come together in your micro planning. So for instance, at Sev, we demolished an existing bathroom to put it somewhere else because it was easier to do a new bathroom in another area than to remove and then replace the bathroom in that spot because we had so much reconfiguring to do. We weren't just sort of putting it back as it was because this was the accessible hall, right? We discovered we had an extraneous egress stair, and we discovered that we could demolish a room in this area and create an open kitchenette, shift the res hall room to this spot where the stair was, a new dorm room over here, a new bathroom here, and the smallest move of all, a door. The door got us the distance to the stair that remained, and the door created a suite, which was something that didn't exist in this neighborhood. So that was a sort of an interesting opportunity to just create another housing opportunity for students that they didn't have. And it wasn't absolutely part of the program, but again, it fit that small move of a little extra benefit to the project.
All right, so we have thrown an awful lot at you, and we want to leave some time for questions. So let's try and leave you with some takeaways and wrap up all these things that we were just talking about. What we just gave you was the example of 4 different campus priorities for Wellesley College, but I encourage you all to think about your institution's values and missions and create your own priorities because you're going to have more than what you can do. So pick a number of them. Don't try and pick all of them. And if they reflect your values and missions, they'll be the right ones. To get started, a study is imperative. The small amount of time and money you'll spend in planning will be worth its weight in gold when you start to implement. I can't emphasize that enough. And the studies really help you then align the actual project scope and details back up to those priorities that you set. And when you keep doing that, aligning and trying to get the right scope, because you're not going to be able to do it all, to reflect those priorities, we've found tremendous success in our leadership supporting that because they can see the mission that it's serving. And as I mentioned at the beginning, be nimble, adjust. Things will change over time. Do lessons learned. Don't be afraid to revisit your plans. It's an important part of the success. Rebecca, why don't you bring it to the micro level?
So at the micro level, being nimble is also very important. You always have to be willing to adjust, particularly when you're on tight construction schedules. You've got procurement issues for materials. So you may have had your heart set as an architect on something. Be prepared to take a different design approach if it's needed. Be prepared to really work with your institutions in thinking about these small ways of making big impacts because resources are limited, right? And so just to leave you with a quick image of what those really small things can do, this is the historic living room at Sev Hall. And this space is obviously of beautiful historic nature, but it wasn't sort of living up to its potential. And through a couple of really targeted moves, one of the biggest of which was the lighting to really accentuate the beautiful historic architecture and also create a light level that was more appropriate for the students for studying and gathering. And then some other small finish moves, some great furniture. We created a space that the student here who's sitting on the sofa actually doesn't live in Sev Hall, had found her way to the living room when we were photographing and said, can I be in the photo? I want to be in the photo because this is my favorite place to study on campus. So we leave you with that takeaway that it's all about creating those moments for your students, and we would be so happy to take questions.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Michelle. That was fantastic. It is time for the Q&A portion of the event. And then for our audience, there's still plenty of time to submit a question using the Ask a Question window to the left. And let's take a look at what we got. All right, our first question is, what small design moves in the classroom and library can be done to create a big campus impact?
I'm happy to take a first stab at that. We are actually renovating our library right now on our campus, and much like the residence halls that that we just used as an example, it's a critical repairs, meaning mostly mechanical, electrical. It's not meant to be necessarily the library of the future in terms of programming, because it's a large building and the deferred maintenance needs alone are quite large. But if I had to pick, now that we've scoped out and we've started construction, what some of the small design moves are, it's similar to some of the images Rebecca showed in the Severance Hall. Lighting, carpet and paint, huge. You can have huge transformations in a building. And with the lighting, you can also gain energy savings if you're upgrading the lighting. So lighting was an area we tackled as a high priority because the return on investment, the ROI, was huge. And it transformed the space for the user experience. So I'd encourage you to look at something like lighting, and paint and carpet is fairly inexpensive and can also, if you don't have a lot of time or a lot of money and looking for a quick fix, can really be uplifting to people's morale and experience just through doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. We did a library renovation project a few years back where the lighting was carefully coordinated with the lighting designers, but in particular, we were able to drive a circadian rhythm control into the lighting. It was at a med school, and the director of the med school was very concerned that students actually go sleep. So through spending a bit of money on controls, we've created an environment where as the evening wears on, the lights do dim, the color temperature changes, and it's tuned to people's physical and emotional responses to the night to kind of help remind them, like, you're going to leave the library, it's going to close, and you need to go home and go to bed. So small things like that do make a big difference in the experience.
Okay. And then were there any pieces of historic preservation that caused any kind of particular difficulty? Were there any pieces or areas that might have been easier or more cost-effective to replace, but the historical significance or the aesthetic of it was kind of too great?
Boy. The work that was done, I feel like the work that is being done across Wellesley's campus is kind of this question writ large, right? But rather than answering the question of, is there something that would have been easier, I think it's more about really trying to understand what is valued by the institution and by society, right? So, these historic buildings we like to talk about the fact that they are markers of who and when they were built. They represent, tremendous effort of many craftspeople to create them. And also they represent, as we know now, an enormous amount of embodied carbon, right? So as we move forward and we ask questions like, do we tear down? What do we remove? What do we keep? We like to really try to think about tracking that embodied carbon so that we can be super clear about the benefits, not just to budget necessarily, but to a bigger picture of economics and society as we move forward.
I can think of one example, and I think you spoke about it, Rebecca, and that was the windows. The windows at these residence halls are all single pane glass, steel windows. They're horrible thermally. but they're beautiful architecturally and they are historic and original to the building. And there's many, 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 many of them. So both from the historical aspect of if we were to replace them, we'd want to replace them with a historically accurate window. However, we wanted energy efficiency. Both of those are huge dollar signs. And so both the cost of it and, you know, in the end, when we were doing the thermal analysis of that envelope, we could get pretty close to what we needed for making the building more tight through the exterior, through the insulation that we put on the perimeter walls. Adding the replacement of the windows would have helped the energy performance a little bit, but nowhere near what the cost of the windows was going to be. So sometimes doing that return on investment analysis and saying, oh my gosh, because we want to do this historically correct, and they're custom windows that have to be energy efficient, the cost is this. And it's going to take so long to get that payback for the performance that we're getting. So sometimes the data can help you decide and drive you on those decisions where you might be a little bit stuck on what's the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then can you talk a little bit more about the technology upgrades to some of the living spaces?
Sure. So there were sort of, I would say, three major things that were done, right? Lighting is a technology in a sense, because it does actually make the spaces much more usable, right? But the other thing that was done is really quite simple. Wi-Fi was improved, right? There's much better ability for the students to use the spaces on their computers, not just for gathering. And then just insertion of things like LCD screens, right, here and there to enable students to use them both, you know, as a collaboration tool, but also, frankly, as a tool for fun. You know, the morning room had an LCD screen installed in it, for instance. I think the last time I was in there, people were binge watching something, Michelle. I wasn't sure what it was because I'm like too old to know the shows, but it looked like they were having a really good time.
Okay. And then do you have any recommendations for audience members who are watching this presentation, they're feeling inspired, and they want to get going or kind of get started? Is there any kind of small little action that they can kind of take or push that first domino over today that can kind of help throw their hat over the wall?
I think this is a tough one to answer because everything that we just talked to you about took many, many years to develop. The thinking behind it, first even identifying the priorities and then the studying it, and then obviously implementing it is going to take some time. But perhaps you know, working with some of your campus to understand what your priorities are as a first step for where you might dive in a little bit deeper and start to study might be one way to achieve that. Again, we started with some tools like the facility condition assessment, which does take some time to do, and it's not free, but it was a very helpful tool. And that was sort of our first step in understanding what the needs were. So understanding those needs and then identifying those priorities. Unfortunately, it's not a quick thing to do, but it's a really important first step. I think that's the best answer I could come up with, Matt.
Okay. And then it looks like that's everything we have in our Q&A box. I was wondering if there were any kind of last words or thoughts that you wanted to leave us with before we sign off for the day.
Just thanks to everybody. And I hope that if you're, you know, challenged with some of the same problems on your campuses or in your work, feel free to, you know, reach out to us, and happy to follow up with any kinds of information if you'd think that would be helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and hope that the presentation was helpful in some way to addressing all of the diverse problems that we know campuses have.